So, the Sunday Assembly, are they a church for a changing culture? I want us to think about a particular change together this morning in Western culture, a particular set of changes that have been happening. And I'm going to do this really quickly because I do think that you've had a little bit of background on this already, or at least I'm hoping there is some. And there will be time to kind of fill in those gaps. But I want us to think, first of all, about a decline in religious identification, the decline in people going to church, being part of religious communities. And the question I want to pose is not anything really about how we necessarily get people back yet, but what is there to fill the social and spiritual gaps that are left behind when people stop attending church? Enter the Sunday Assembly, a community that was founded around about 2013 in London. And they go by this kind of moniker of atheist church, and they talk about the celebration of life. They are, for all intents and purposes, a congregation that looks like a church, except they do things a little bit differently. And so there's so many questions that come off the back of the Sunday Assembly. So I'm afraid what I'm going to do is leave you with a lot of questions this morning. What do they believe? I'll try and suss that out with you. Why do people go? What does it provide for them? I'm also going to have a look this morning with you at this question: can we say that the Sunday Assembly is a church in its own right? And does it replace the church? And then just finally, to tie things up, I'm going to have a look at some more recent research on where the Sunday Assembly is today. And we'll be thinking about the fact that they've actually gone through a little bit of a downturn recently. And what does that look like for them? And what can it tell us about the church as a kind of ecclesia or a social grouping? So just very quickly, we will start with a little bit on culture change, this decline in religious identification. And I'm going to talk about something kind of that has come up in my own work, which is the rise of something called temperate atheist attitudes. So what are these? What do they look like? And who are these people? How do they contribute to this particular idea and this particular community? And then I'm going to tell you a story, and we're all going to have some discussion about a visit to the Sunday Assembly, which is based on some very real research that I did myself in London. I'm going to go through the why, the who, and the what of the Sunday Assembly. I'll give you a bit more of a detailed picture about why they exist, who goes along, what they do, what they believe. And then we're going to have a little bit of time for analysis, although I will be kind of racing through a lot of this morning. There's a lot to get through. This idea of Sunday Assembly as church and the decline of the Sunday Assembly more recently. As I've said, hopefully we'll have time for some breakout discussion around about 10-15 minutes for you to decompress and have a think through some of the questions that we raised. And then maybe we'll have a little bit of time for a question and answer session at the end. So if you have questions, you can start writing them down as of now. I've got two very quick slides that describe this kind of culture change that has happened in recent years, this decline in religious identification, first of all. And these are two cultural changes, this one and there's another one, that I want us to be aware of because I think they help us to understand the foundation and the growth of this particular group that I'm speaking about. So I'll do a very brief overview of both of them. I will spend not enough time on both of them, basically. Just to let you know, I've put lots of extra reading suggestions at the end of my slides. So hopefully you'll have those and you can go and chase up all of the people that I mention, and there's a kind of fuller bibliography if you want to go and find out anything else in detail. So Linda Woodhead and Paul Heelas, two sociologists who did some very groundbreaking work on the downturn in organised religion in the UK in the 90s. And when they did a study in Kendal, it was called the Kendal Study, a really imaginative name. What they found was people were starting to leave organised religion and they were looking for spirituality elsewhere. And at the time, they predicted a hemorrhaging of support for organised religion in the UK. And we've all heard these quite depressing statistics. The British Social Attitudes Survey a few years ago focused entirely on religious attitudes in 2017. So 53% of respondents at the time said that they had no religion, and that went up to 71% in the 18 to 24 age bracket. So quite high. Linda Woodhead says that in the UK, no religion is the new religion, and she has done quite a lot of work on the rise of a particular group of people who are non-religious. Now, this is difficult working in theology. The rise of religious nuns. So not the Sound of Music nuns, not the Catholic nuns in the Habits, but N-O-N-E-S. So people who don't identify as belonging to a religion. They also don't identify as being atheist either. And religious nuns are interesting. They might comprise quite a large part of the UK population. Statistics show they could be up to 50%. They reject religious labels, so they wouldn't call themselves religious, but they would also reject secular ones. They wouldn't call themselves atheists either, which is interesting. I think what is going to happen with this is the census data that we've collected. I mean, recently, if you're in England and Wales, and we will do our census data in Scotland next year, will tell us probably a little bit more about what this community of people looks like, who they are, and what they believe, and whether they would classify themselves as atheists or they don't. So that'll be interesting to see, and we'll keep an eye on that. Within this way of thinking, I think it's almost a little bit hopeful if you're worried about the downturn of religion at all. There is a little bit of hope in this because it kind of complicates the picture of straightforward secularization. It sort of makes things a little bit tricky. It's not a straightforward rejection of religion. It's a kind of middle ground, I would argue. And this is backed up by another culture change, which is the rise of what I call temperate atheist attitudes. And temperate atheists or temperate atheism, it's a term that I use in my own work, and it describes a perspective that came into view around about the 2010s. It was a little bit of a reaction to new atheism, so our friends like Richard Dawkins, and this very public, high-profile rejection of religion that happened after 9/11. So this particular band of humans, this is what they believe. And they believe that God is not real, which makes sense because they are atheists. They also believe that new atheist arguments have reflected poorly on atheism as a whole, that they're too polemic, they're too extreme, and they don't cast atheism in a very nice light. Crucially, temperate atheists believe that religion has been an important source of human culture and understanding throughout history. So actually, religion is still very useful to us. We can still use it. It's still something that we should have within our culture, within our society. If you've read any of the new atheist texts, they believe that religion should be completely eradicated, whereas temperate atheists would say, no, it's part of our culture, part of our history, and our shared sense of what it means to be human. Atheists do not need to be hostile towards religious believers. That's really important for the temperate atheists. They believe that there's no need to be unfair or mean towards religious believers, no need to take the mick out of them, as some other new atheists would have you believe. And here's another really kind of crucial part of what we'll be thinking about this morning. Atheists can still draw on religious practices, arts, writings, and architecture for their wisdom, beauty, and consoling powers. So this is a perspective that draws on religion and spirituality while still maintaining an atheist kind of undertone. One of the key texts is on the screen for you just now, Religion for Atheists by Alain de Botton. But there are lots of examples of this particular way of thinking in practice. So it's not just something that people think and then they leave it in the books. This is something that people actually practice as well. So Julian Baggini, the philosopher, has some really interesting articles that he's written for The Guardian on fasting rituals, Hindu fasting rituals that he has done himself as an atheist. He's written about grief rituals. He's written about doing sermons. He's actually done some sermons as an atheist himself. And he's also written an open letter to God, which was fascinating, really, really interesting. So he's clearly very interested, despite being an atheist, in what religion can do for him and the way that he thinks. Elaine de Botton, who's at the bottom of your screen, he is another philosopher who wrote the book Religion for Atheists. And de Botton is interesting. He has this idea of what he calls an agape restaurant within his book. And within the agape restaurant, there's a kind of eating practice that's done in community. And it draws on communion, Eucharist, Passover rituals, draws on a lot of different kinds of religious rituals to bring people together. At one point, he also submitted plans for a temple for atheists. And I've linked that there. You can go and have a look at that too if you want to. Rabbi Sherman Wein is another really interesting figure. He is the kind of founder of humanistic Judaism. And this comes from an attempt after the Holocaust to hold together Jewish culture and also a lack of belief in God, or a struggle to believe in a transcendent God after the Holocaust. And so he's founded humanistic Judaism off the back of this. A really interesting case study, I use this one with my students in Aberdeen quite often, is Greta Vosper. And Greta Vosper, maybe you've heard of her, maybe not. She's an openly atheist minister in the United Church of Canada, and she is still in post in her particular church. And she sort of revealed her atheism to her congregation. And they said to her, but we really like you as a person and we like what you do. So we would like to keep you. And so she uses the church and the structures of the church to care for people in a pastoral sense, but without any belief in God. And the UCC has allowed her to remain in post. Again, you can go and have a look into her if you'd like to. A personal favourite of mine, Vanessa Zoltan and Casper ter Kuile are two atheists from Harvard University. And they draw on the Harry Potter text by J.K. Rowling with a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And what they do in the podcast is they use sacred reading practices from both Judaism and Christianity. And what they do is they kind of take each chapter of the books at a time and they look at it through a sacred reading lens. So all really interesting examples. And what these have in common is they're all examples of atheists that draw on religious structures and practices. And this is something that the Sunday Assembly is a really prime example of. So just hold in your mind those two particular changes, one that's in thought, in atheist thought, and one that is more of a kind of wider societal change. Okay, I'm going to tell you a wee story now, as my granny would say. The best way to introduce you to the Sunday Assembly is really to take you there and to try and describe what it is like to be at the Sunday Assembly. So I want to read you some extracts. They're taken from the book that I brought out, The Sunday Assembly and Theologies of Suffering. And as I read to you, I'm interested to know what you think. I might ask you a few questions about what you think of this. So here are some questions to keep in mind as I'm reading. What strikes you about this description, first of all? What stands out to you when you hear what you hear? Are there any parts of the Sunday Assembly service that I'm going to describe that remind you of church? Any specific denominations or practices? Other thoughts, questions arising? Okay, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. If you feel inclined to do so, I'd invite you to close your eyes so that you can imagine what I'm about to tell you. But as long as you're sitting comfortably, that's absolutely fine. So I'd like you to start by imagining that you're standing outside of a building, okay? Either a community centre, maybe a library, an old church, or a town hall. Take your pick, it's up to you. This isn't a purpose-built building, but there's a lot of life in its walls. And inside the hallway is teeming with activity. There are volunteers in green t-shirts winding their way around the foyer, and they're shepherding people towards a main hall. So make your way inside, take a seat in the main hall. If you're feeling gallus, as we say in Scotland, you might want to sit at the front. If you're feeling a bit nervous, like I was when I first went, you can come and sit at the back. The room is going to start to fill up, and you'll be hearing music blaring from a huge sound system on the stage at the front of the room. And there are instruments on the stage laid out for the band. The noise level is just going to get louder and louder as more people stream through the doors, and they greet each other with hugs. Most of these people are young, they're under 50, they're white, they're well dressed but casual. Soon you'll be interrupted by the arrival of a charismatic leader on stage. This person has a real presence felt throughout the room. A wide magnetic smile, a strong voice, and a compelling stage presence. At their prompting, the first song begins, and a band with guitars, drums, and an accompanying choir plays along, while the words of the song are projected onto a screen at the front of the room. All across the hall, people jump to their feet, they clap along, they sway in time to the music, and some even raise their hands in the air. The opening anthem might be by Journey or the Rolling Stones, the Beatles or Fleetwood Mac, but the chances are you'll know it, and so will everybody else. There's a palpable energy in the room. After a few songs, the leader will give an introductory address based on a theme for the week. And this could be anything. It could be forgiveness, love, childhood innocence, dying well. After that, there's a reading from a member of the congregation, like a poem or an extract from a book. Next, an invited speaker will come to deliver a longer talk. This could be a scientist talking about particle physics, psychologist talking about the science of attraction, mindfulness practitioner advertising their particular brand of consciousness. And after another song, the leader appears again, and they invite everyone to join in a moment of reflection. They prompt the congregation to express gratitude for their lives and to celebrate their human existence with thankfulness. After this, a collection is taken. Large bags are passed around and filled with handfuls of cash. Don't we all dream of that in church? Then the leader delivers a closing address with boundless energy, and in perfectly quotable idiom, they speak about the key influences in their spiritual journey and their determination to get the most from life. All around you, the congregation is listening, transfixed. And once more, the room swells with life as people sing, clap, and sway their way through the closing song. So I hope you enjoyed your visit to the Sunday Assembly. I'm interested, just very quickly, to hear from you. If anybody has any particular thoughts, you're welcome just to unmute yourselves and tell me what you thought or what struck you there.
It reminded me of going to a big new wine church.
Yeah, that's interesting. Was it anything in particular, or was it the whole description that kind of?
Well, the whole description, really. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been in a Pentecostal church for 30 years, and it sounded like every single Sunday, apart from the music at the Sunday assembly might have been more enjoyable.
I have to say, it certainly is. They've got good music taste at Sunday Assembly, if anything.
Yeah, how was the leader appointed?
How is the leader appointed? That's a great question. Sometimes it's simply a volunteer who volunteers to lead all the time. But in the smaller congregations, they tend to actually cycle through leaders. So they tend to have a team of people. It's not just the one person at the time.
Okay, I was interested in who they express gratitude to. You know, they're encouraged to express it, but who's it to, and what does it mean?
Very good question. I will answer that actually as we go along, but I think that's one to hold in mind. It is a good question, because if your worship or your thankfulness isn't going upwards, where does it go? Would be one question to keep in mind. That's a good one, thank you. Any other thoughts?
It reminded me of a humanist funeral I went to a couple of years ago, which was lovely, and there were poems and reflections and music, but at the end we just felt there'd been something missing. There was no hope. There was just like, he's had a lovely life, that's it. And it just felt a little bit like that. It's like all the trappings, but I wonder what's at the heart of it all. Don't know.
Great question. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like going to a concert, isn't it? I really love music and live concerts, and I do get that feeling of euphoria like a big worship gathering, but at the end of the concert there's an emptiness because it's over. Whereas after a beautiful time of worship, I feel full and nourished, not empty. So
interesting.
That was the biggest difference that struck me.
Fantastic. Those are just such good thoughts that you're all having, even early on. So it's been really good to hear from you, and I hope that you'll keep thinking about this, because I think everything that you've identified so far is spot on. And it's interesting, the Sunday Assembly is such a, when you go and you actually are there, it's just as it is just now as we're talking, it's quite a personal experience. It tends to be how people react. So it's very good to hear what you think. Thank you so much. I'll move on. I'll take you through a little bit more about Sunday Assembly, and then we'll get to have some time to talk a little bit more about this. So the Sunday Assembly, just to give you a little bit more background, was founded in London. So they are British. In 2013 by Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans, who are, interestingly enough, two comedians. They are not they're not religious people. They used to be. They were both at one point church leaders in respective denominations, but both left. And they're professionals at putting on a show, basically. But they founded the Sunday Assembly. And they had this huge outpouring of desire for Sunday Assembly congregations around the world. And at its high point, the Sunday Assembly was present in over 70 cities worldwide. And now most of these were white countries, majority white countries, the UK, USA, Australia, New Zealand, places like that. As you've seen already, the Sunday Assembly draws on the institutions and the structures of Christian churches. I said here that it's broadly charismatic, and I think what we have discussed so far probably supports that idea, with the standing and the hands up and the swaying and things like that. Esther Adley, writing for The Guardian in 2013, when this first all kicked off, said, "A churchgoer who stumbled through the wrong door would find much that they recognised." And again, you've given me some indication already that that is true. So we can discuss how far this goes later on. But first of all, let's look at the why of the Sunday Assembly. So why would you put together a church like this? What would be the reason? So Sanderson Jones, who is one of the founders, co-founders of the Sunday Assembly, said that he would go to carol services or friends' weddings. There would be so much about it that I really liked, the togetherness, the rituals, but I just couldn't get past the God bit. So for Sanderson, there were a lot of things about church that were very comforting, very consoling. He liked the ritual, he liked the feel of church. It's just that he struggled with the belief and the doctrine of church, which is interesting because it sounds almost exactly like what Alain de Botton says in his work. This need for a sense of togetherness and being together despite a lack of faith. We've heard so much about this during COVID-19, our inherent need for togetherness and being with one another. And the Sunday Assembly talks a lot about combating loneliness. in their work as well. So really important, the sense of togetherness. Remember too that Linda Woodhead and Paul Heelis predicted this downturn in church attendance. They said there will be a hemorrhaging of support. What they also said in that particular piece of work, which I've pointed to it on another slide so you can go back and have a look at it, is that when the church experiences a downturn, there will be these new expressions of spirituality and community that come out of this, because people require something, they require some kind of outlet for togetherness. And so this could be one of the new expressions that they pointed to. Why take so much from the church? I could speak about this for hours and you would never get to hear anybody else this whole week ever again. We could just be here talking about that one question. Quickly though, I'll say there's no history and tradition. This is a community that was founded in 2013, and there is a need to build on something, a sense of familiarity or a need for normalcy, which comes from a lot of people having been to church and then going to the Sunday assembly. I would say that there's a very high proportion of church leavers in the Sunday assembly, rather than simply people who are atheists who have never been to church before. And this idea as well that atheists can still make use of religion, which comes, I think, from temperate atheism. The Sunday Assembly would say that they are not based on anything that Elaine de Botton has ever said. They have a little fight with him on their own. But I think from the research I've done, this idea really kind of refers back to the work that I've already spoken about, quite strongly, in fact. So I do have a bone to pick with them there. So here is a typical attendee at the Sunday Assembly. So when I was doing my fieldwork, I had the absolute pleasure of being in the field at the same time as a sociologist called Josh Bullock, which was so interesting because we both ended up doing field research. At one point we overlapped, we were in the same place. And Josh taught me an awful lot as a sociologist. I don't think I taught him as much as a theologian, but who knows. But Josh has this really interesting concept for introducing people to the average kind of Sunday Assembly attendee. And he calls her Jane. And in sociological terms, we would call her the ideal type. And the ideal type is not necessarily an average, but a picture of somebody typical of an organization or a community. And so this person, Jane, who I'm about to describe to you, she isn't everybody who goes to the Sunday Assembly, but she's somebody that you would probably bump into if you spent about 5 minutes there. So Jane is around about 34 years of age. She'd be white, British and middle class. He says she would definitely shop at Waitrose, which I think is hilarious because I can't even say Waitrose. Jane would probably have some religious or church background, so she probably would have had a lot of involvement in the church when she was younger, Sunday school, youth group, things like that, all the way growing up. Until probably the age of 18 to 22 when she's at university and loses her faith at some point. So she will have gone through either just a simple move away from the church, a simple busyness in her life that drew her away from the church, or an active loss of faith or an active questioning of faith. And Jane now identifies as non-religious. She is likely a religious nun, like one of those people that Linda Woodhead tells us about. Again, not a Sound of Music nun, N-O-N-E, nun. And Jane also, her belief system is quite humanistic. She believes in equality, she believes in kindness, and the golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated. So this is your sort of typical Sunday Assembly attendee. Now, if you're interested, note that I said she was white. The Sunday Assembly is a really white space. We can talk about that if you want to. She's British rather than being an immigrant. And she's middle class. She probably has quite a lot of money. To say that she's middle class off the back of London research says something in itself as well. And these beliefs as well, equality, kindness, quite open-ended, quite kind of sort of beliefs you can put an individual spin on as well. So what happens at the Sunday Assembly? Well, you've heard what happens already, so I'll keep this brief. Communal singing, all these kinds of modern songs that they like to sing. Talks as well. There's usually a centrepiece talk, either from a member of the congregation or somebody who's invited in. So I've heard talks from all kinds of people. The first time I went, someone was dressed as a Disney princess talking about kindness. I mean, it could be anything. The next time I went, it was a particle physicist. So it's such a mixed bag. You can't even explain. Reflections, there are financial offerings as well. And then there's another part that I didn't get to talk about, which is this much I know, or X is doing their best. And so this is a part of the service, and they do call it a service, where somebody in the congregation shares their life story, almost like a testimony. They share something about themselves, what they're trying to achieve in life. And so when I was doing my PhD, I got to do Katie is doing her best at the Edinburgh Sunday Assembly, and I got to talk about my doctoral programme and how that was going, which was really meta. It was just such an odd experience. But they like to share, and the testimonies, and this is crucial, have to be very upbeat and positive. So there's no room to say anything negative, and we'll get back to that shortly. The Sunday Assembly have a 3-part motto: live better, help often, and wonder more. And we can break this down later on if we want to, but just very briefly, this is based on what they would say is living your best life, and whatever that means to you as an individual, to live your best life. Helping others where you can, so volunteering opportunities, encouraging a sense of wonder about the world, so learning, coming together to learn more about the world that we live in. And there are some other underlying principles that are kind of worth flagging here. Now, lifefulness is a new idea from Sanders and Jones. I think it's kind of an amalgamation of living better and wondering more. And it is what it says on the tin. It's having a full life fullness. And this is what he's chasing down now. Just how do you have a full life, especially as somebody who believes in one life without an afterlife. There's also this idea of radical inclusivity, which has actually been a little bit controversial in the Sunday Assembly because it was lifted and laid from a particular outreach program at the Glide Church in San Francisco. They have a homeless ministry, and they talk about radical inclusivity based on the gospel and the idea of feeding the poor. And this actually was taken by the Sunday Assembly, and they've kind of run with it just for their own devices. So it's a difficult one because the Sunday Assembly is inclusive as a place. Sure it is. But if you go along and you mention that you're religious, you will be told, please don't speak about that here. Please don't bring any particular ideas. If you are a staunch atheist, like a soapbox new atheist type, you will also be told your views are too extreme. Please don't have them here. And so there is a little bit of a question around whether they are truly radically inclusive in that sense. And also I've talked a little bit about this already, but the celebration of the one life we know we have. And celebration is a word that comes up a lot at the Sunday Assembly. It's a really important part of what is done in this particular community. So celebrating, emphasis on the positives, emphasis on the good parts of life. Hold on to that because that becomes important later on. I believe that you've been set a reading from me. I'm really sorry about this reading. It comes from when I was a doctoral student. It's not my finest hour, but it's a piece of research that I did. So when I was with the Sunday Assembly, I went to congregations in London and Edinburgh, and I also got the opportunity to visit the Sunday Assembly's Worldwide Conference, which was in the Netherlands. So I got to go and see a few of the congregations in the Netherlands too. And the stuff on the vestiges of religion comes specifically from Edinburgh, which is the only Sunday Assembly congregation in Scotland. Wasn't my first choice of where to go. I'm in Aberdeen, it's at the world's edge, but Edinburgh was the only place. As I went along, and I wrote this kind of piece of research on the Edinburgh congregation. And in this research, I found a couple of interesting signs of church influences at the Sunday Assembly. And I called these vestiges to be fancy. And you can read more about this, but just as a really brief recap, one of these vestiges is the community structures. Obviously, they have congregations at the Sunday Assembly. They have planning committees at the Sunday Assembly. They have similar ways of doing things to the church. They've even had Sunday Assembly synods before, if any of you are synod-minded people, which is very interesting. A continued investment in theology is something that I found much more in Scotland than I did in England. And perhaps this is because I was in London rather than being in a kind of smaller community in England. But this continued investment in theology, seeing Jesus as a figure to be celebrated in an atheist church is something that I write about. Sanderson Jones undertaking visits to several different churches as part of his research for the Sunday Assembly is something that I talk about. There's a real comfort with the church, with some people who are in the Sunday Assembly. Of course, there are people who don't feel comfortable, and that's why they're there. But it was interesting to note the people who did. Celebration of religious events and holidays. So there are a couple that I want to draw your attention to. One is called Yule Rock. It happens around about Christmas or Yuletide, and it involves getting together and having almost like a secular carol concert. So rather than getting together and singing Hark, the Herald Angels Sing, or Away in a Manger, they get together and sing Step Into Christmas, or I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day. There was another one round about harvest time called Top of the Crops, which is a pun on top of the pops. Really quite similar, and they took, I believe, a couple of collections, this was in London, for food banks at their Top of the Crops kind of event that they did. Denominational divides. This is one that happens in Scotland, where we have a massive hangover of Protestant versus Catholic attitudes. There's a, so I'm from Glasgow, and there's a joke in Glasgow that if you tell somebody you're an atheist, they'll say to you, are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? There's a real kind of hangover of these cultural markers. And so that endures in some way in Edinburgh, which is really interesting. Just to say also about denominational divides, actually, there have been some interesting kind of schisms in the Sunday Assembly. There was a split in the New York Sunday Assembly quite early on over the extent of the atheism that was going on. Some people wanted it to be more atheist, and the Sunday Assembly tries to be a bit more inclusive. So there are actually, strangely, atheistic denominational divides as well happening. And pastoral care. So I heard from so many people, there's a strong desire to replicate what the church has. People think of the church as a place of care, and pastoral care is the real kind of hallmark of that. And so they want to replicate that in groups and social events. Although while I was there doing my research, there wasn't actually any kind of dedicated outlet for that at the time. Let's do a little bit of analysis together. Is the Sunday Assembly actually a church? Well, you could argue that it is. If you didn't know too much about the church, or if your ideas about church were not necessarily undershot by a lot of theology, you could say, yes, it is a church. If church is about listening to talks and sermons, then yes, the Sunday Assembly is in some ways a church. If the church is about having a place for reflection, again, there are places for reflection. If the church is somewhere that we think about life's big questions, you know, there's that at the Sunday Assembly too. If it's about gathering together in fellowship, again, there's spaces to gather. Is the church about celebrating life? Well, we've just been through the Easter season. You know, in some ways, Yes, Easter reminds us that life is something to be celebrated. And self-improvement. So if church is about becoming a better person, all of these particular facets of the Sunday Assembly, you could say, actually, we're dealing with a church here. Yes, the Sunday Assembly is a church. However, in terms of Christian theology, this becomes a lot more complex of a question. And arguably, we have to remember this idea of the church as a collective body of Christian believers. And when we're looking through a lens of theology, it's interesting to think about the New Testament and the kind of earliest configurations of church as ecclesia, as a collective body. Because Christians didn't go to church. It wasn't a place that they went to improve themselves. It wasn't a place that they went to, believe it or not, listen to Journey or anything like that. Christians were the church. They weren't going to the church, they were the church. So this is something to bear in mind. It's not simply about practices, although if we are going to talk about practices, the church does have some distinctive beliefs and practices, and one that is interesting to think about is sacraments or sacramentology. And we could talk about a lot of different ones. I'm just going to give you this one example here, which is really nicely summed up for us in the work of the Baptist theologian Paul Fides. He calls it Eucharist. I am of the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, so I would call it communion, even though I can't really say that word. But he talks about the importance and the centrality of Eucharist, and how that kind of sets the church apart from other social groups. So this is a quote from him. I'm just going to read it out to you if that's okay. And he says, social groups outside the church and the coherence of things in the natural world may become at times a sacramental community, in that they become occasions for Christ to embody himself and become gateways into the dance of God's life. Paul Fides likes a dance metaphor. So basically what he's saying there is there are possibilities for social groups to become kind of sacramental communities and places where God is seen. But he says only the church is formed by the actions of the two sacraments. So he's a Baptist. He would say there are two sacraments, which recall the story of Jesus and bring it into the present. Only in the church are bread, wine, and water, means through which Christ promises to be present and where he can regularly be expected to meet us. So I'm interested to think with you a little bit more about this later. For now, I want to kind of leave you with this idea that to say the Sunday Assembly is church, I mean, in many ways it is. It is a place for people who've been to church before, and it's, I think in many ways there's a lot of religion left in the Sunday Assembly. And there's certainly a lot of spirituality left. Paul Fides would just put the marker in and say, right, it's not a sacramental community, though. Just bear that in mind while we're thinking around this. It's something I'm sure you'll have kind of picked up as we went along. I want to do a bit of analysis. This actually comes from a little bit of more recent research, which is that the Sunday Assembly, thankfully they waited until I was finished my doctoral programme, but they have more recently experienced a bit of decline. And I think this is interesting as part of a wider changing culture, that the church and the Sunday Assembly are in many ways facing quite similar issues around retention of people at the moment. So there's been a really significant loss in total attendees at the Sunday Assembly in recent years. Worldwide, there were about 5,000 monthly attendees in 2016, and within 2 years that had dropped to about 3,500 people monthly, which is quite a significant downturn. And then Faith Hill, not the country singer, unfortunately, Faith Hill, a writer for The Atlantic, brought out this really interesting article, which talked about the Sunday Assembly specifically. And this is a quote from her article, which I have linked for you to go and have a look at later. And she says, even as the growth of nuns has revved up, the growth of secular congregations hasn't kept pace. After a promising start, attendance declined and nearly half the chapters have fizzled out. Building a durable community of non-believers, it turns out, is more complicated than just excising God. So what she's saying there is, interestingly, there was a boom in the Sunday Assembly and it took off. And this is, of course, why I decided it would be a good idea to study it for my doctoral programme. But there has been a downturn. There has been a movement away from this prominence of the Sunday Assembly. And why is that happening, is the question. Again, I could be with you for a very long time, but we only have a few minutes left for me to speak, so I'm going to go quickly through this. But while I'm speaking on this particular slide, something to bear in mind is how many of these factors, how many of these issues have you heard about with reference to the church? And how many of these are common issues between the church and the Sunday Assembly? First of all, a lack of people power. So putting on a big show requires a lot of volunteers. This is on a regular basis. So most Sunday Assembly congregations meet every month. We need a lot of volunteers to make that happen. And of course, these positions are usually unpaid. So how many people are going to want to give up a lot of their time, their energy, their money to make this happen? Different views on atheism is something I've hinted at throughout this, but we do have some people who want to have really heated debates on religion or who want to campaign against it. I was in, where was I? I think I was in the Netherlands, and I was at the international conference when this happened, but I was in a meeting with some people, and there were some people from Tennessee who had started a Sunday Assembly, and they said, we have to put signs all over the place saying that we're atheists. If we're remotely unclear about this, then people won't come, because if we're not saying that we're atheists, then people think we're Christians because we're a community that's doing something on a Sunday. And so they'll think we're Christians. And also they're surrounded by churches, absolutely surrounded by churches. And they said, we have to be really active and vocal about our right to be atheists. Otherwise, that's not, it's not going to work for us. Whereas a lot of other people who are living in somewhere like the UK would say, well, we're not as heated about it. It isn't so controversial to be an atheist. We're just here to celebrate life. So different views on atheism. Here's one you might recognise, other events and options. So competing with other Sunday commitments. There are many Sunday commitments, and the Sunday Assembly has also had issues competing with these. Linda Woodhead says that there's no motivating elements. There's no natural need to meet with other people week after week. We need to have a very powerful motivating element to keep people coming along to something like church or something like Sunday Assembly. And there isn't anything that's necessarily motivating people or pushing them to do that, which is interesting as well. And part of this is to do with the identity of the congregants. So if you're a religious nun, N-O-N-E-S, not a Sound of Music nun, then non-religion is maybe not a strong part of your identity. And there has been some research into this. So this is not something I'm making up for the purposes of telling you this. There is some indication that when you have a religious identity, it's part of your core, it's part of who you are. When you're non-religious, it's more difficult to articulate how that is part of your identity. And so people become quite indifferent and quite uninterested. They might feel that being non-religious is something to be taken seriously if they live in Tennessee and everybody around them is religious, and it's like they have to publicly admit their atheism. But if you live in the UK, where it's not exactly controversial to not hold these beliefs, then there's nothing compelling you to make it your identity or make it your life. And so the identity is important as well. This is me. A refusal to deal with deeper issues of human experience, a lack of engagement with global events of suffering, and insufficient attention to individual struggles of congregants. Now, this is something that I found out when I was at the Sunday Assembly, when I was doing my research there, very, very quickly. This is what I found. This comes directly from my book. Now, listen, this book is very expensive. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this on the recording. If you want any chapters from it, like say you wanted 6 of the chapters in order that they were written in, I could sort that out for you. So if you would like them, or you'd like to read this, then please let me know, and I can legally sort something out for you. The Sunday Assembly is focused on celebrating life. This we know, okay? So they're very firmly focused on celebrating life, but the organisation itself, because it is so intent on celebration, is not fully equipped to deal with kind of deeper issues of human experience. So there's no language to talk about the more difficult parts of life. A member of the community dies and there's no way of making sense of that. Maybe there's something that happens, a global event of suffering. I talk about some of the shootings that happened in Paris in 2016, some of the community reaction to that in the book. There's a lack of engagement with these events, or insufficient attention to the individual struggles of congregants as well. So people can get lost in the Sunday Assembly and feel that their particular issues are not being kind of looked after or taken care of. And this is a difficult part of the Sunday Assembly to talk about. There could be reasons why this is the case. A lot of people spoke about how it's the wrong remit for the Sunday Assembly. It's there to celebrate life. So it's not the remit of the Sunday Assembly to actually get involved in helping people in that way. The other reason that I used to hear a lot of was it's not established enough yet to have a particularly firm grasp on things like pastoral care as well. But there is a kind of reticence to engage with this. And I noticed this and I thought about it and I thought, it's not a very good thing that this is happening. And then I turned the lens back on myself and the kinds of churches I've been a part of. And I thought, this is something that we do as well. This idea of passing over suffering, not holding it, not sitting with it for very long, when it comes to death, when it comes to disaster. It's actually something that affects churches too. I talk in the book about white Protestant denominations, and I go after my own really, but we're not the only ones. But then we have this really uncomfortable question: is the church really any different when it comes to the Sunday Assembly? Have we all made the same mistakes? Are we all dealing with the same issues, the same problems? In principle, we have practices of lament that we could talk about. We have eschatological hope that we could talk about, hope in life after death. And this should differentiate us, along with what Paul Fedus has said about the church being a sacramental community. That would make sense, wouldn't it, to have that differentiation in principle. But I have said in the book, we need more work on practicing a lament culture that kind of differentiates the church as a place that can hold people, whatever stage they're at in their lives and whatever place they are. And this is why I talk about theologies of suffering more than anything else in the book. And again, I could talk about this forever, but let's move along because we're running out of time. So what is next for the Sunday Assembly? Well, that's actually quite a tricky question. So Faith Hill says, for those who stick with the Sunday Assembly, the challenge now is to make the community last beyond their own generation and to find new congregants as the number of non-believers grows. So interestingly enough, the focus becomes missional, does it? That's something we can talk about. During COVID, there has actually been, so the Sunday Assembly have moved online, and these are chapters that are a little bit flimsy to begin with, for all the reasons that I've described to you. So post-COVID, will there be any congregations left? I think there will be, but they might be quite severely depleted, remains to be seen. It's always fun doing research, which is live and unfolding. We just never know what's about to come around the corner. Questions about atheist uses of religion are and will be important, because I think if we are experiencing any kind of secularization, it's complex. It isn't straightforward. It isn't a divorce from religion that happens overnight. There's a lot that goes with it, and people's collective memories, their social memories, are so attuned to the church still. I think that's quite hopeful. And I think if people are still using religion and drawing on it, it opens a lot of questions for us as people interested in church. Well, what can we learn from organisations like this? What can be illuminated by them? Again, with the arrival of more census data, we will find out more about the future of the nuns, who are quite a big group in society. And of course, I would always say there's further study needed on the role of the church in this particular culture change, and also kind of in practice what this looks like for us moving forward. So what's next for the Sunday Assembly? Hold tight and let's see. That kind of brings us really to a bit of a close. I wanted to see if we could maybe do a little bit of a breakout group for 10-15 minutes. And I'll tell you what I think we could talk about, and then it's up to you what you actually do. I've got 3 questions here to ask you. This is just to guide your thinking if you need it. You've probably got lots to say without needing these questions, so please don't feel that you have to stick to this. You can talk about whatever is important. And what does the existence of the Sunday Assembly tell us about our changing culture, first of all? And secondly, what do you think about the Sunday Assembly's use of church elements and practices, and what does the Sunday Assembly's more recent decline reveal for the church? So 3 possibilities for discussion, and then I thought maybe we could just have a bit of Q&A. So if there are any questions that you have that you'd like to ask me, then absolutely bring those with you. So Keith or Ellie, are you happy to do some breakout groups? Oh, Keith, you're muted, sorry.
Yes, yes is the answer.
Fantastic.
So I will set that up now.
Wonderful. I'll leave that in your capable hands.
So I'm going to set those up now. I'm not sure how the time bit of it's going to work out. I think whether it's set up to allow an open-ended one, but I'll sort that as we go.
Oh, that's great. Bring people back.
Go. Opening all rooms.
All right, good luck, everybody.
Yeah, I think it's set up for a 5 minutes, so I might have to renew them.
That's fine. That's all right. We'll see if people want to come back.
Yeah. You might automatically bring them back. I might have to.
It's a tricky one.
Yeah, I think I've got it set. I've got it set that way, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's counting down.
Is Jeff? Yeah. You've set it for 4 minutes, though.
5, I think.
But did it need to be longer?
It needs to be longer. Yeah.
They might need a little bit longer.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how I can't even remember how I set it up that way in the first place now. So.
Do we think Jeff is stuck, or is it just that he's
not clicked the?
No, I'm not stuck. I'm opting out of the small group discussion for this one. So
I'll just take that's fine.
10
You're
minutes.
very much allowed to have a little 10-minute break.
Yeah, that's it.
Let me pause the recording because we won't need.
The woman who got up, she was from San Diego, and she's from the States. She'd come a long way. And she was doing the part of the service that I was telling you about earlier. This much I know, X is doing their best. So she stands up and she goes to the front of the room and she starts to talk about how her husband died of cancer last year. Her mother passed away. She's had to have a biopsy on a tumor that she has. Everything's going wrong in her life. You know, she's lost her younger cousin. There's just terrible things have happened. She was made redundant. And so she goes through this whole screed of awful things that have happened to her. And she got to the end and then she said, I'm feeling a little bit more hopeful now. And everybody went, hey, you feel so hopeful. You're so inspiring. You're so wonderful. What a great person. And then she went and sat down at the back of the room and they carried on. And I got up to go for a cup of coffee and I found her at the back of the room and she was just sobbing. She was just absolutely sobbing. And I went over to I don't know what I did. I just went over to say hello, and I was like, thanks for sharing. And I said, are you okay? And she was like, oh yeah, I'm fine, everything's okay. And then I felt really overcome. And I actually write about this in the book. I went outside and started crying because I felt like there wasn't any space for any of that. And I had come with the impression that there wasn't, and I had come to test it, and it all just kind of happened. And so it's quite a kind of visceral thing, and I write about it in the book not just as something that is built into the way that they do things, but something that can be experienced when you're there as well, which is difficult. And it's not something we get off the hook with in the church. Sometimes it can happen in churches too, so we're not we're not entirely off the hook. But no, that was a good question. Thanks, Rosemary. And Michael, your hand was up next, I think, and then Helen.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a Quaker, and over the last 10 to 20 years, certainly in British Quakerism, I think to some extent in America as well, there's been a gradual rise in friends who describe themselves as non-theists. And this has caused some considerable alarm and upset and coming to terms with amongst Quakers. I've sometimes spoken with some of those people to try and find out where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. Some of them are perfectly happy with God language. Some are much less so, actually, and complain about people standing up, talking about the presence of Christ being amongst us. Or some people say, well, you hear as God this, God that, it drives me up the wall. Mm. And I think, well, you've joined a religious organization, you've joined a church, what are you thinking of? I don't entirely get it. With some of them, I'm happier. Some of them talk about having a spiritual life and being in tune with the spirit and so on, and with divinity. I just wonder to what extent, I mean, there are some Anglican theologians who are non-theistic. I mean, even right back to Don Cupid back in the 1980s, he was perhaps the first. What do you feel is the kind of crossover there? I mean, I'm just sort of thinking along those lines.
It's very complicated. Yeah, it does, absolutely. It's really complicated, isn't it? I mean, I wonder, because one of the things that I found when I was with the Sunday Assembly is a lot of them would say, oh, I'm in a church congregation, they just don't know I'm an atheist. And I'd go, why? Why are you going to church and doing this? What are you doing? Why are you going to these communities if you don't agree with the language? And they'd say, but I just want to be around people. I just need to be with people. I just need to be in a community, and I don't know where to go. I just need to be somewhere. And so it's kind of made me think about how, and I'm still thinking about this, to be honest. So this is not really an answer as much as an affirmation of your question. And I'm still considering how we in the church build a space for people who are questioning or unsure or not necessarily as religious as we would think they should be coming through the door, and what that looks like to have people like that within our congregations. So I think it's just to affirm that's a really important discussion that we do need to have, I think, not just in one denomination, but I would say across a lot of different denominations too. Helen, was your hand up?
Yeah, it was up. I took it down, but I was just going to make a comment really I made in the breakout group, and I think it was the age and the background of the people who are going. To me, it feels a bit like people who've been to Glastonbury, and actually they've put their wellies away and they don't want the mud anymore, but they just want to be doing something where they're getting together and being with other people. And, you know, probably most of them graduates, I should think, you know, well, that's what it feels like from what you're saying.
Professionals, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. So it just kind of feels like it's almost a progression from where they were when they were at university, just gone university, and now they're going to do something a little bit different. And possibly drop away after they've done that and realize that actually life is a bit different anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're right. Interestingly enough, the Sunday Assembly has appeared at places like Glastonbury to kind of, I wouldn't say recruit or go on mission, but they have done. And there seems to be a kind of commonality between the sort of natural high that people feel when they're at these kinds of events and what they want to carry over into their services as well. Absolutely. Femi, your hand was up, and Paul, your hand is also up as well.
Okay, well, I'll go. Just an observation and a question, drawing on sort of Alan Richardson's work. You know, I think it's really significant that it talks about assembly. You know, drawing on his work, is that the idea of assembly hasn't got, you know, originally hasn't got a religious connotation. It's just a secular thing. And to actually sort of talk about church and assembly, I think, you know, to be quite clear that assembly is just simply a gathering of a group of people. When we use the word church, we are actually drawing on and bringing on loads of other stuff. And it's interesting to think to how the word assembly is used in other contexts. For instance, Citizens UK, part of their structure is to have an assembly.
Yes.
So, and the way in which the word assembly was chosen in the New Testament, in the beginning aspects of it, was non-religious. It was not connected to any Greek cult or et cetera, et cetera. So that would be, I think, so the use of the word assembly, and then the interchangeable, the way we talk about assembly and church, we miss the significance of that, I think, perhaps. And my question is whether some of your research and thinking was more tripart, in the sense that you've drawn these analogies and relationships between the church and the assembly. But have you also looked at the concept of assembly and the way you've described it as it expresses itself in other forms, like going to football, going to concerts, or other ways like that? Maybe the idea of assembly, what really looking at, it's got, if you like, directly nothing to do with church. It's got more to do with what it is to be human, what human beings do when they come together.
Yeah, absolutely.
To give it a bigger context of what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope to is the answer. So this was all formed off the back of a doctoral project, and I was working on not a lot of time or money, so it was quite kind of small in that sense. But what I've kind of been thinking about, I suppose this just comes again off the back of what you just said, is during COVID. We've heard a lot about people coming together, and we have heard a lot about how these different assemblies that are maybe secular or non-religious are being missed by people. So we've talked, I've heard a lot of people say they miss exactly as you say, going to football games or being together in person. And I think there is more research to be done on the function of what does it mean to assemble in a way that is secular, and also in a way post-COVID now. I think everything is going to be coloured by that. What does that mean when we come back together? And what are we missing? What have we missed about each other? And where do we go from here as well? So it's not something I've looked at directly yet in my research. I've done a little bit on assembly and ecclesia, but I'm certainly going to try and do a little bit more on what it means to gather, I think, especially after COVID. So great question, thank you.
Just picking up, coming back very quickly, is that one of your slides you put together something like coming together and fellowship. And actually, you know, to actually explore that, because I think coming together and fellowship are not exactly the same thing.
No.
And I think in your presentation, you pointed to the fact where people can come together, but when you look closer what it means to come together, there actually isn't the fellowship, if you like, the deep bonding of people.
Right, and the identity as well.
Yeah. Words, again, they're not interchangeable. They need to be broken down, I think, a little bit more.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Thank you. That's really helpful. And Michelle, your hand is also up.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Really, really interesting session. But my mind's been thinking about the singing, because music is really emotional and emotive. And when I love to sing and dance around the kitchen, but when I'm singing a song, I'm often thinking about, even kind of slightly subconsciously, who am I singing this song to? I have people in mind. You know, Ed Sheeran's song about the photo in the ripped jean pocket that I think was written about his nan or his mum or something. But every time I sing it, I think about my children. And I was wondering, you know, if that's one of the biggest differences, because when we sing in church, and just to acknowledge, I do know that not all worship is singing, but I'm speaking about sung worship here. Then we have a very specific, very centralized focus, don't we? So we all know that we're all thinking about Jesus when we sing these songs. So I'm wondering if that's what's missing. That's an element, because in the Sunday assembly, everyone is having a unique experience rather than a shared experience.
Yeah, that actually, thanks, Michelle. That comes really nicely off the back of, I think, what Paul just said about identity and shared identity, and whether coming together is something that happens equally across the board. It is a really interesting one, because it's almost like it's kind of hard to tell you without telling you what it's like there. It's almost like you're at a concert and you're singing a song, and you might have a shared experience with people. You know, you might have a shared experience of going to a concert and seeing somebody, and that's all very nice. But is it, as Paul has asked, the deeper identity and the deeper fellowship that we have with a direction within our churches? And you do get the sense that there's maybe that's not there in the same way. But again, it's really individual, and it really does depend who you ask. But the songs themselves, just to kind of point this out as well, songs themselves are quite upbeat and happy. And so they're not as kind of pensive maybe as Ed Sheeran. I think Ed Sheeran would be too emotive for the Sunday assembly even. So very kind of peppy and happy songs, which again goes back to what are we holding space for, and what are we thinking through together as we're joining together. I've got a question from Judy. I'll go to that and then I'll jump back to you, Ellie, if that's okay.
And I think we better make those two the last two.
That's fine.
Very nearly 1:45.
All right, we'll go quickly. Judy says, do you think the decline in the church that's mirrored in Sunday assembly is partly due to a lack of cohesive identity and failure to understand the culture and needs of attendees? Very possibly. I'm working to try and understand that a little bit better just now. I think the Sunday assembly can tell us a lot about who we are as church. I think it forces us to sharpen our elbows a little bit and figure out exactly what we mean by things like, as Paul has said, fellowship, assembly, coming together. What does it involve? Who are we as people? I think those are the questions that get pushed, and they're really important questions to be asking. And I think sometimes just having that comparison is so helpful. Michael says no Leonard Cohen at Sunday assembly. Yeah, no, it's not not a Leonard Cohen kind of place. Ellie, did you want to say anything?
I wasn't sure whether you could see the chat or not, so I was just pointing out Judy's question.
Fantastic, great question. I mean, fantastic questions, all of you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely to come and see you. Thank you.
Katie, thank you very much indeed. I found that absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think the idea that it poses, the Sunday assembly poses a lot of tricky, or at least pertinent questions back to the church is a really significant one. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Katie.
If there's anything else you need from me, I think Ellie has my email address. We can continue the conversation, keep chatting, and have a great rest of your week. Enjoy all your other sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and we'll be back in just slightly under half an hour at 11:15 for Ellie's session on disability theology and the pandemic. So we'll see you then.
All right, I'll close this session.
I think, yeah, I mean,
unless you have any housekeeping.
we're still recording.